the quiet stillness of a dimly lit hospital room, Mark lay motionless, his body ensnared by a coma he couldn't escape. Tubes and wires snaked around him, connecting him to the sterile machinery that kept him alive. His eyelids fluttered beneath closed lids, and his mind plunged into a nightmare from which he couldn't awaken. The dream began with Mark standing on a desolate, fog-shrouded street. The night was heavy with an eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy shroud. Moonlight filtered through the dense, mace-casting, elongated shadows that danced along the cobblestone pavement. He felt an inexplicable dread creeping over him, a gnawing anxiety that refused to be ignored. Mark walked aimlessly down the street, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. As he turned a corner, he found himself in a small, dimly lit cafe. The room was filled with empty tables, each adorned with flickering candles that cast an eerie glow across the cracked porcelain. The air was thick with a sense of déjà vu, as though he had been here countless times before. A faint voice whispered from the shadows. "You can't escape," it hissed, sending a shiver down Mark's spine. He turned, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Panic gnawed at him as he realized that he was trapped in this repeating nightmare. With a surge of terror, Mark rushed towards the exit, but as he reached for the door, it swung open of its own accord, revealing a nightmarish scene beyond. The once empty street was now filled with grotesque figures, their faces twisted in agony. They shuffled forward with slow, deliberate steps, their eyes fixed on Mark. He stumbled backward, unable to tear his gaze away from the nightmarish procession. Mark blinked, and suddenly he was back in the dimly lit cafe. The same flickering candles, the same sense of foreboding, and the same whispering voice. "You can't escape." Each time Mark tried to flee, he found himself back in that cafe, confronted by the same unsettling scene on the street outside. The cycle repeated endlessly, a never-ending loop of terror. He screamed in frustration, but no sound escaped his lips. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Mark's torment continued unabated. He tried to make sense of it, to find a way out, but the dream was relentless. He couldn't wake up, couldn't escape. It was as if he had been imprisoned in his own mind. In the waking world, Mark's family kept vigil by his bedside, their hearts heavy with despair. Doctors and specialists came and went, their words a blur of medical jargon and uncertainty. They couldn't explain why Mark remained trapped in this nightmarish coma, unable to wake. Inside the dream, Mark's torment deepened. The cafe became a suffocating prison, and the whispering voice grew louder, more menacing. "You can't escape," taunted, its words echoing in his mind. One fateful night, as Mark stood in the cafe, he felt a strange sensation, a glimmer of hope. It was a small detail, something he had overlooked in his previous iterations. The candles on the tables, which had always been uniform, were now flickering at different rhythms. It was a subtle irregularity, but it was enough to jolt him out of his despair. With renewed determination, Mark focused all his willpower on that flickering candle. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the flame. Pain seared through his hand, and for a moment he thought he had made a terrible mistake. But then something incredible happened. The dream began to unravel. The cafe dissolved into a whirl of chaotic colors, and Mark felt himself falling, tumbling through a vortex of sensations. It was a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced in the dream. Suddenly, Mark awoke with a gasp. He was no longer in the coma-induced nightmare. Instead, he found himself in a sterile hospital room, bathed in the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. His family stood around him, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Mark, you're awake," his sister exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Mark couldn't speak. He was overwhelmed by the realization that he had escaped the never-ending dream. It had felt so real, so inescapable, that he had begun to doubt if he would ever wake up again. As he looked around the hospital room, Mark knew he had been given a second chance at life. The nightmare had been a terrible ordeal, but it had also been a reminder of the fragility of existence. He vowed to make the most of the life he had been granted, to cherish every moment, and to never take anything for granted. Little did he know that the dream, with its endless loop of torment, had changed him in ways he could never fully comprehend. It had shown him the depths of his own resilience and the importance of holding on to hope, even in the darkest of circumstances. And as Mark lay in his hospital bed, surrounded by the love and support of his family, he couldn't help but wonder if the nightmare had been a necessary trial, a test of his spirit. Whatever the answer, he was determined to make the most of his newfound lease on life and to live it to the fullest, with a profound appreciation for every moment of wakefulness.